Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another one of our Through the Bible studies, in which we'll be going over an entire book of the Bible, not verse and chapter, but rather topic by topic, in which we'll be just giving you a general idea of what happens in the book, not as a substitute to personal Bible study, but as an opportunity to know what to study if you are considering these books. Now, as we are transitioning from the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, that collective archive of Israel's first and Israel's greatest king, two separate individuals, we're now moving on into the kings of Israel. And this, of course, would be the book of Kings. First Kings would give us an account historically of mostly northern Israel, but it also goes into some of the kings in southern Israel. And there's a difference you'll find out when we get to king number 3. This covers about 300 years of history, so obviously, just like the United States isn't even yet at the time of this recording 300 years old, we don't attribute all of our history to one historian, so it's not unreasonable to just basically make that kind of dismissal of saying, I guess, the citation of authors isn't as important as our ability to dig these things up and find out, yes, they did in fact take place. Yes, there were rulers and kings with these names who did these deeds, who even by their enemies are acknowledged to have existed and accomplished the things that they did. And we can find these things that's still on display in the British Museum and as well in museums throughout the world. But ultimately, when we're talking about all of this, understand the point as to why this history was recorded. God doesn't abandon anyone. We walk away. Very cheery image being given here, and you're going to see that in action as we see Israel's kings slowly ebb away from their relationship with God and see the resulting consequences. And of course, how they recorded this history is fairly straightforward. They recorded history as they witnessed it. And this, of course, begins following up after 2 Samuel ends, with, of course, David getting his final affairs in order. Now, David's still alive, but on his way out. He's starting to get the shivers. And as for those of you who are familiar with those who are elderly, that's a result of poor circulation. He, as the king, was able to have one of his concubines, not for any hanky-panky business, but rather just to provide him body heat, was getting his final affairs in order, the most pressing of which was who would inherit the throne. The ceremony would demand Adonijah, his next oldest son, since Amnon was murdered by his second oldest son, Absalom, who was then murdered by his cousin Joab, who is still alive, by the way. Probably should take care of that too. But let's first figure out who's getting the crown on his head first. He says Solomon is going to be the king of Israel. So after this is publicly announced, officially and religiously established that God himself recognizes this as the transition of power, Adonijah is approached and given the same heart that David had towards his enemies. He didn't eliminate competition. He just said, look, I don't want any trouble. Welcome in this household as long as you don't cause it. And so Adonijah, wanting to be the one to inherit that kind of power, being the thing he always dreamed of, that classic fairy tale ambition that we see, well, Adonijah tried. It's obviously he couldn't be out front about it, so he tried to do a little bit more subversive things. He went to Solomon's mom, Bathsheba, and he said, hey, I was wondering if you and maybe one of Dad's concubines, I've enjoyed hanging out with her. What would it be cool if we got married? And of course, Bathsheba doesn't know any of this business that he's trying to pull here. She's like, well, why don't you just talk to Solomon about it? So, oh, no, this is stuff I think you can handle. Well, Solomon found out about it, and as well, we're not all familiar, I'll tell you what's happening here. When you marry the king's wife, when you marry the queen, you're becoming the king. This was an official announcement by saying, maybe if I do this under the radar enough, I can say, I married one of David's wives. I'm the next king. See? Proof here. See? Adonijah was trying to pull a fast one. He was given fair warning by Solomon, and so he was executed. Solomon is starting to deal with these early strands of subversion early on, at first. David also gives careful instruction. The people who were giving him the most problems in life, these are people you need to give stern warning to, and if they are going to get erratic about it, then you need to take care of them, because they will only be thorns in your side, only obstacles to Israel's peace. So they are eliminated. The people who were basically cheering at him and throwing rocks at him when he was kicked out of Israel by his son Absalom. And likewise, and most importantly, Joab was taken care of. If you remember our previous study in 2 Samuel, you know he was a very interesting individual. Good soldier, not human being. And at the end of his life, he'd really been brought to a sad state, because this old man's basically like, I don't want consequences. And so he's hugging the horns of the altar of God. And basically this would be, like in a game of tag, hugs and safeties. In the book of Leviticus, anyone who clings on to the horns of the altar, horns is a symbol of power, you're putting yourself at God's mercy there. And so you wouldn't be punished, you would be coming to God for mercy, and you'd be, in a sense, officially demanding a fair trial. Well, for crying out loud, Joab, you've murdered plenty of people in broad daylight. The priests all know it, you know it, and so they just take him down from there and they execute him. And so basically this is fulfilled. Joab didn't remember to read the next verses that followed after it. If he is guilty of the bloodshed, no refuge will be provided for him, even if he grasped hold of the horns of the altar. So sucks when you only read the parts that are relevant to you, not the fine print. But nonetheless, Solomon's still a kid. All intents and purposes, early 20s at the most, and he's now been given the kingship of Israel. All of this people, all of this nation. David's finally gone on to his reward, or rather he's about to. And Solomon's just like, I don't know what I'm doing. First step towards wisdom, literally in this case, because when he went to sleep that night, God came to him and he said, because of such a blessing that your father was to me, Solomon, I'm going to give you one wish. Anything that you want, you will have. Now note, 9th century BC. This is 900 years before Christ. The first and earliest account that we have, and I go more into detail about this in the study that we did on the Disney film Aladdin. I encourage you to listen to that. I give dates and citations for this. But the earliest record that we have of any Middle Eastern folklore or legend that involves the influence of a genie giving you 3 wishes, right? That spiritual entity, a jinn, a genie, is a spiritual entity. It's often more associated with a demon. But this is the first time, many, many centuries before that book was ever even thought of, that this sort of idea came, that God himself was coming to Solomon. He says, I'll give you one wish. So Solomon thinks about it, always a smart thing to do, and he says, look, money's worth nothing if I'm not smart with it, and even if I have peace, I'll probably mess it up. I don't know how to do this job, God. I don't know how to lead your people. I don't even want knowledge. I want the ability to make good decisions. God, I want wisdom, the ability to use knowledge well. And God liked that. He said, because you didn't ask for riches or for peace, I'm going to give you all 3. And so this folklore of a spiritual entity giving you 3 wishes is originating with an actual historical event. And how can we verify this? Because of the legacy of Solomon. Because not only did God directly tell him in this dream that you will not only be given wisdom, second only to me, because I'm the source of that wisdom, but also you're going to be more wealthy than anyone who has ever lived in Israel before or after you. And likewise, you are going to enjoy a peaceful reign. You'll be given victory over your enemies. You won't be fighting battles. You'll be building up my nation. And so he wakes up from that dream. And how do we know it wasn't just because he was doing some hookah or something? It's because we see Solomon going on to write thousands of proverbs. many of which are collected in the book of Proverbs today, writing hundreds of very famous songs, writing books, not just limiting to some of the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, which was an account of his first marriage, by the way. But on top of that, writing books about botany and zoology and all of these, and architecture and all these amazing things. He constructed architectural marvels, which were including but not limited to his most significant contribution to the ancient world in one of its 7 wonders, the Temple of God. And the majority of the book of 1 Kings actually goes into details of emphasizing just how much effort, how much detail and design and intricacy went into even designing the parts of the temple that people wouldn't see. It goes into all these things about it. But when we're talking about the contributions that Solomon made to the world, we're talking about a guy who built the temple of God that would basically be a living witness, an opportunity for all the nations around them, from all the way as far as Greece to the area that was known as Ethiopia, which would not be in Africa, Ethiopia today, but more like modern Sidon. The Queen of Sheba came as far to visit him and hear of his amazing wisdom and get a personal opportunity to see what the true and living God was all about. Literally a global set of evangelism for him. All of his writings, which are the ones that have significance and relevance to our relationship with God, included in the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, made Israel richer and more powerful than it had ever been in its entire history. They said, and without embellishment, by the way, because other accounts, even hostile accounts, would verify this, that silver was as common as rocks in Israel during these days. He brought peace to Israel during his entire reign and was the wisest man in history, practically, second only to the person of Jesus Christ himself. Those were his achievements, and this was quite the life that he lived. But unfortunately, even if you know the right thing to do, does that mean that you'll do it? Well, obviously, as far as human nature, our self-destructiveness considers itself to almost be admirable in how predictable it is. Because here's the problem. Among all of his achievements, we've just listed 5. He made one mistake. He disobeyed God's command for kings not to build up wealth, women, and war instruments. Let me read to you the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. When you come into the land, note, Solomon would have to write out his own copy of this, so he knew it, which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Interesting, this was several hundred years before the time of King Saul. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. So he was to be Jewish. That was a requirement. They shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply horses for himself. Use of military and war, right? Nor cause people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Same deal. For the Lord your God has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he, notes, multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Remember that. Your choice of a spouse is literally one of the most important decisions you could make in your life regarding your relationship with God, because it will either make this life heaven on earth or a living hell. Recognize that. You shall not greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. It's not a problem to have money, it's a problem to be had by money. So it shall be, when he sits on the throne of the kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, and from before the priests, the Levites, and it shall be with him. He shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and its statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren. that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Now recognize this, one of Solomon's most famous proverbs. It's referenced multiple times, but I think most of you would know it by heart. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. And second only like it, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He understood this. He knew this. He hand wrote his own copy. And yet, despite knowing not to multiply horses, especially that would draw him back to Egypt, he built a world-renowned stable, which would house thousands of horses that people are archaeologically uncovering and being able to visit even to this day. It probably meant that he had quite a collection of ponies. In fact, in the Song of Solomon, there's a reference to one of his most prized possessions, and of course in which he compares to his wife as a compliment to her, but nonetheless a disobedience to God's command, because his mare was a specially bred white horse from Egypt. Likewise, he had a net worth, take this with every bit of irony as you think it should, of 666 talents of gold every single year. Now, that wasn't all the money that he had. It was how much he accumulated every single year. Now, 666 talents, aside from that number being associated with something else, a talent was a measurement of weight that would be the most you could expect someone to carry without literally putting their life in danger. And in Israel, that would be around 110 pounds. These people were farmers, so they had their lats developed. But understand, in modern estimates, this would amount to, in U.S. currency, that is, $3,836,160,000 U.S. And of course, the value of gold would fluctuate, but just understand that. That's a lot of cheddar. And when we're talking about them being commanded not to accumulate wealth for himself, that's more money than I will ever see in my life. Understand that. What was that third one again? Oh, choices in relationships. One wife, correct? 2, 4, 6, 8. I'll stop building it up. The dude had 700 wives. And on top of that, 300 side chicks, I guess is the modern term for it. Just girls on the side that were only there for, oh my goodness, you did not obey that commandment. Now understand, the reason why he had accumulated so many girls, I mean, the horses, that makes sense. The guy's got to have a hobby. And the money, sure, you're taking in income. But the reason why he married so many women and took this conscious effort to surround himself with all this drama is because when you would make alliances in the ancient days, the best way to give an insurance policy that if you made a deal with another king that his nation wouldn't attack you is to become a part of his family. So what you would do is you would exchange daughters. That was the pagan way of basically forming a relationship politically. Now, Solomon obviously followed a God that could establish a little better deal than that. However, wanting to wisely not offend someone's customs. I mean, the girl, look at her. You see the logic here? Had the wisdom, didn't use it. And what's really unfortunate about this as well was that when Solomon married these girls, as the scripture says, they drew his heart away from God. And because of this detrimental influence to his relationship with God, these girls started to want the pagan gods that they worshipped when they were growing up. I want a shrine to Ashtoreth. You mean that God that and I apologize for this, but we're just being honest about history here. You mean that goddess that literally demands all children under a nation that belongs to her to become prostitutes the moment they become of age? And whether that's male or female or animal or family member, it's just indiscriminate. And that people are supposed to take home statues of this girl with like 50 boobs, that god? Okay. So he built a shrine to that. Honey, I want a god to Molech. You mean that god that requires you, if you have a baby that you don't want, well, as a offering of basically an excuse to indulge in your bad habits without the consequence of having to raise this child, you heat up a brass oven that isn't made in the image of this god and roast a newborn baby alive, justified, of course, culturally, we say scientifically today, but culturally by the idea that you haven't named the child yet, therefore it's not actually human, and you literally are doing human sacrifice for the sake of pursuing your further bad habits. Okay. I want to worship Baal. You mean the thing where you do the stuff with animals and cut yourself and the same stuff they're doing in Mecca today? Okay. And all these things. Oh my goodness. Setting Israel up for disaster. And it was these kinds of compromises that were devastating to his relationship with God. And why the book of Ecclesiastes is so depressing. Because he had everything this world had to offer on both ends of the spectrum, both the light and dark side of the force. And he said, man's purpose, stick to the light. Because there's nothing here but that I didn't have there. This is just counterfeit of this. So, Solomon's life ultimately amounts lots of achievements, but one horrible mistake. These pagan temples and idols were available to the people of Israel, but not popular yet, just for the sake of his wives, right? Well, Solomon's oldest son, King Rehoboam, finally takes power after Solomon dies. And he grew up with everything handed to him, both literally and figuratively, on a silver platter. So obviously, he's going to surround himself with a kind of friends that are more drawn to him for the sake of money than the guys that his father hung around, that not only learned from him, but that Solomon was willing to learn from. The smart guys, right? Rehoboam, when he took the throne, Solomon's advisors, his friends, the people who learned from his dad and who also his dad learned from, told him, if you want the nation to follow you, lower the taxes. Understand, it makes sense when you're building up a nation, when you're bringing in all that net worth, when your people are making a lot of money, and you have reason to then take that money from them. They're going to be okay with it, but you're not building anything now. So here's what you do. Cut the tax programs. The people will love you for it. They'll follow you forever. But on the other hand, Rehoboam's friends, his college buddies, he's like, no, man, if you lighten up on them, they're going to think you're a pushover. What you got to do is you got to nail the hammer down harder so we can have bigger parties, you know? How else are they going to know you're large and in charge if we're not enjoying all this stuff with you? And Rehoboam, being the, oh, yeah, you get the idea, being the guy that he was more willing to go with the stuff that made him look better. So he gave his famous announcement to the people after taking his father's throne. You thought that my father whipped you with vipers, like, you know, how much he demanded from them in work? Well, I'm going to whip you with scorpions. Not exactly a campaign slogan that's going to go over well. And this literally ended up destroying the nation. And I mean that, literally. He remained king of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin for another 17 years, where he married he followed his dad's example. He had, like, I think 60-something wives and a lot of kids. That's too much. But nonetheless, he didn't really achieve anything but causing a civil war in Israel's history that drove 10 out of 12 of the tribes of Israel out of the nation. Now, he became the king of the tribe of Judah. what about the northern kingdom? Who was the new king of Israel? Who was this new leader that ended up taking over what Rehoboam's tax plan essentially destroyed? Well, his name was Jeroboam. And Jeroboam's rise to power actually took place a few years before Solomon's death. The prophet of God, whose name was Abijah, told Jeroboam that Solomon's son was going to be a flake. Imagine that. And he ended up showing as a prophetic sign to him, he took his robe and he tore it into 12 pieces. Then he gave 10 of them to him. And then he explained that he would take over the majority of the kingdom after Solomon died and would have a choice to either follow God or something else. The options were available to him. If he followed God, he would be blessed. If he didn't follow God, well, he'd have to trust on these fake things to bless him. Well, unfortunately, when this actually took place, when he established northern Israel, and he established their capital not in Jerusalem, where the temple of God was, but in Samaria. That may sound familiar to you, but they aren't the Samaritans yet. Not yet. We'll get to that in 2 Kings. But their capital in Samaria, obviously, they could set up an altar to God anywhere that they wanted. They had most of the cities of refuge there as well. These were the cities in which the priest would give people fair trials and lead in worship and so on and so forth. But obviously, you don't got Disneyland, right? I mean, California may be a cesspool of political correctness, but I mean, crying out loud, look at all the fancy rides, big cities, right? And Jeroboam looked at that and he basically said, insecurity intensifies. I don't think God's going to be able to keep all these people here. They're going to want to go back to, they'll deal with Rehoboam's nonsense if it means that they'll get to enjoy that personal relationship with God. I know. I'll give him our own God. We'll do our own thing. Let's go to my ancestors' history. Let's see. Nation of Israel, nation of Israel. Okay, let's see here. How about that golden calf that our ancestors worshipped at Mount Sinai, where God had directly manifested his glory? Forgot to read 2 chapters later, when after they were all violently raping each other in front of this thing, that God literally sent Moses to come down, take the 10 commandments, saw all this taking place, and is like, which one aren't you breaking? And literally broke them on the ground. And he said, I'm going to pray to God that all of you guys aren't charcoal briquettes right now. And he offered them mercy, obviously. The people who instigated this mass orgy were executed. But, oh my gosh, Jeroboam, take a hint. You think that ended up doing to the nation? It sent them down a spiral in which the nation would never recover from. He didn't trust God to handle matters of worship, so he turns to the golden calf that the people of Israel worshipped in the wilderness, and ultimately understand his only achievement that he could speak of in his life was that 80%, probably more, of God's chosen people ended up following him and separating from Judah. They made him their king. God chose him to be their king. But his mistake was that he introduced idolatry into Israel, which would ultimately result in their destruction, their exile, and becoming the Samaritan people. No longer Jewish, but when they were taken over by the kingdom that was known as Assyria, their capital, by the way, was Nineveh. They were the people that Jonah was preaching to before they would ultimately come in and judge them. Used by God in the same way that Israel was to the Canaanites a couple hundred years before. We're talking about a not so small mistake, because when the Jews were taken away into captivity, the Assyrians just spread them out throughout their empire. They had to get comfortable. They intermarried with the Assyrians, disobeying that law. And when they returned to the nation, they were basically the kids of the kids of the kids of Jews. And so they were more Assyrian than they were Jewish. All they had as far as a relationship with God at that point, culturally anyway, was maybe a blip on Ancestry.com. Some of them may have known about God, but none of them were worshiping him. And that was the kind of state that the Samaritans were in during the time of Jesus. That's well what they're going to be when we get to the book of Ezra. Now, this is where things really start to get sad. The name Jezebel might ring a few bells for you guys. If you're familiar at all with anything in biblical history, you'd know definitely associated with the not so savory kind of individual. But northern Israel will be the focus of the majority of 1 Kings up until this point. And Jeroboam's entire family, because of these actions to just hand themselves over to idols, couldn't be blessed by God anymore, so therefore couldn't be expected to be protected anymore. His entire family was wiped out by a man named Nadab, who made the same decisions. He's like, great, I have the power now. I killed all my competitors' family. So then a guy named Baasha comes around and murders his whole family, and then they end up taking over. And then Elah comes along and does the same thing. Then Zimri, then Omri, then finally Ahab. Now, Ahab, obviously none of these people could take a hint, since Israel did not have a single godly king since the moment it was founded, but Ahab was the worst. And not entirely because of his own actions. But once again, just like we talked about with Solomon, the choice lied in who he chose to marry. Ahab made a lot of alliances, and we'll talk about that when we get to his reign, but understand the king of Sidon, whose primary god was Baal, and Baal, by the way, is just the generic Semitic term for the god, El, right, master. And this god Baal, he was worshipped through all of these bloodletting rituals and circling rocks and all this kind of stuff. The Nabateans referred to him as Allah. This was later adopted in the 6th century by, I guess the 8th century historically, by a man named Abdul bin Malik, who made up all of these stories that essentially centered themselves around a man named Muhammad, who was a caravan warlord. And that was essentially the foundation of the Nation of Islam. If you'd like to challenge me on this, I'll be happy to provide all the historical sources from the Muslims' own documents. But when we're going into all these things, understand Baal worship was the centerpiece of Sidon, and they were incredibly violent, brutal, just weird people. And this culture founded on this bloodthirsty monster they turned to for rainwater, he wanted to make an alliance with. And so, desiring the noble pursuit of peace, said, yeah, I'll marry one of your daughters, and you can have one of mine. Well, the king's name was Ithbaal I, and he exchanged his daughter Jezebel. Now, Jezebel, she had a lot to say for herself, especially as far as how the culture in that day viewed women. She wore the pants in the family. In fact, she wore the pants of the nation. In fact, she was the one who walked those pants in the nation to who they were all worshiping, because her and her influences to her devotion to this God made her not only, as in every single Sharia-dominated nation that we see in the world today, hunted down and murdered anyone that would dare worship any other god but hers. She knew how to enforce power. She made Baal worship the majority religion, and basically during the entire reign of Ahab, the knowledge of the true and living God in northern Israel was all but exhausted. We're told that only 7,000 people had ultimately not bowed the knee to Baal in Israel. When you're talking about a country full of millions of people, that's almost non-existent. So, definitely spiritually influential. Politically, she literally got away with murder. Hillary Clinton was elected in this matter by constantly setting people up to be executed by using God's law to manipulate and lie about people to give them these kinds of accusations, so that whenever she, or more specifically her husband, wanted something, she would hire a group of thugs to go before a court and say, oh, hey, the Bible says on the witness of 2 or 3 people anything's made true. This guy blasphemed the name of the true and living God. And you say, no, I didn't. He said, I have 3 witnesses here, and we all said it. And the priest would look at him and say, it's your word against theirs. This is the law. And he would be executed. And Jezebel would be the one who would ultimately have this kind of blood on her hands. She was constantly doing this to get her way. And let's ultimately be honest, she was the one who was actually ruling Israel, because King Ahab had the constitution of a 5-year-old. He just did not stand up for anything. All he did was mope and whine and just like, oh, I want his field. And it's like, what are you, a man or a mouse? Squeak up, right? So that was basically what Jezebel achieved. She became the queen of Israel, took over the religious domination in her day, and just absolutely used this puppet of a husband to establish a power that no other woman in that day and age would have known. Now, among all of her achievements, she made one very serious mistake. She made personal enemies with the true and living God. And that's when we read about the prophet Elijah coming on the world scene. Israel had basically walked away from God. However, God did not give up on them, because during the reign of Queen Jezebel, let's be honest, King Ahab wasn't even there, a prophet named Elijah, his name is God be praised, right? He walked uninvited into the king's court and just said, it's not going to rain for 3.5 years, and left. Now recognize the significance of this, because when you would walk into a king's court, maybe for those of you who know the story of Esther, we'll reiterate this when we get to the book, but when she walked into the king's court, she was fearing for her life, because if the king didn't recognize her and raise his scepter, the guards would treat that as an assassin, because as they remembered with Baasha and Elah and Zimri and Omri, all leading up to Ahab, assassination was a serious issue to consider. So if anyone, even the guy's mom, walked in to the king's court and he wasn't expected to be there and wasn't being surveillanced and monitored while he was in there, then they were automatically assumed to be an assassin and executed. The only thing that would stop it is if he took the little stick with the ball at the end of it, raised his scepter as the symbol of authority, and saying, I recognize their right to be here. They're okay. Now, this prophet just walks in there. Like, who's really in charge here? And none of the guards touch him. Understand, they are being paid for these kind of situations. Jezebel's there, being fed grapes and stuff. Ahab's just kind of being in the corner, hoping he doesn't get yelled at in the next hour. And Elijah just walks in, this little hairy, short guy, and he's just like, hey, in the name of the true and living God, it is not going to rain for 3.5 years. And he just leaves. A little shaken by this, no doubt, but also taking into consideration for the fact, why did Israel worship Baal again? He was the rain god. And this rain god was a very important god to be on the good side of if you lived in an agrarian desert. You were depending on farms, and if the farms didn't get rainwater, you lived in a very hot and arid environment, so they would dry out and die. You needed that rain. So through this fake god, you would be depending on his favor. And it's like, we're appeasing Baal all the time. We're offering human sacrifices. We're raping animals. We're cutting ourselves on a regular basis and smearing it on our faces and the blood of children and circling our stones. We're running between the hills and stuff. We're doing all those ceremonies and pilgrimages. We're good. This Elijah, his God, what has he done? And they just kind of laugh this whole thing off until a year passes. And they're starting to go, did we missing anything here? I mean, maybe we're just having a dry spell or something, but can't exactly blame carbon emissions or any other stupid statistic that the internet tells us. Really getting low on water here? Then 2 years passes. This is not a coincidence. Where is that Elijah? What's going on? 3 years passes. We're gonna kill that guy. Whatever he's doing, we're literally all dying of thirst. Water's become the most valuable commodity in history. We've never known any kind of shortage like this. We're not getting rain. And then finally, Elijah shows up again after the 3.5 year mark, and he says, look, how long are you going to stand between these two gods? If Baal is God, worship him. If God is God, if Yahweh is God, worship him. But for crying out loud, stop playing the middle ground here. Israel, who's God? I think you've seen that Baal can't provide you water. Tell you what, let's have a God off. Whichever God can call down fire from heaven, he'll be the one who's worshipped. We'll happily submit ourselves to your guys' murder frenzies any time. But if our God is real, then you guys will be held according to his law as false prophets. You will be executed. Do you understand this? They're like, Allahu Akbar, absolutely. So, they go up to a place called Mount Carmel, and they have a little showdown. They built their big, ornate, fancy altar and all their kind of symbols and stuff. And then Elijah, according to the law, just sets up this stone altar. Something natural, something that's not carved or ornate, but simply made from God's creation. And so he lets the prophets of Baal go first, and they are doing their whole frenzies and chanting, and they start cutting themselves and screaming and throwing themselves on the altar. Incinerate me, O God! And all this other nonsense, and they do this for hours, just getting whipped up in this demonic frenzy. And the hilarious part is Elijah starts trash talking them while they're doing it. And he's just like, hey, you might want to yell a little louder. Maybe Baal's on the toilet or something. He can't hear you. Maybe he went off for a walk or something. And so they're just killing themselves and each other. And then finally, after all this nonsense, they're tired from all the blood loss, and so Elijah's like, all right, you've had your turn. And he just looks to heaven and he says, God, not for our sakes, but for your glory, show these people here that you are the true and living God. And God calls down fire on the altar. And oh, and by the way, remember how valuable water was at this point? No rain for 3.5 years. Before he makes this prayer, he has them pour all the water that they brought with them till literally there's a dam filling around the thing, a moat rather, filling the whole thing, and the thing's just sopping wet. He says, call this down for your glory, God. And he calls down fire, not only evaporating the water, but literally turning the rocks the altar was made of into lava. And having witnessed this miracle, the prophets of Baal do not fall on their knees and ask the true God, who's shown and verified himself as real through a miracle, to find, and with the terms and consequences in writing, still rejected. So Elijah turns to the people of Israel and says, there's our terms. According to God's law, these false prophets are to be executed. And so they are. There's 700 of them. And then he says, it's going to start raining soon. You better get back to your temple, Ahab. So he gets in his chariot, and Elijah's outrunning him. Miraculous interventions all the dang day with this guy. But unfortunately, among his achievements, Elijah definitely did a very incredible thing. He led Israel's last major turn back to the true and living God. He had a ministry that was supported by miracles, including calling fire down from heaven, and all these other amazing things of basically preventing it to rain, causing a drought through prayer alone for 1,260, I believe, days. We're going by the Babylonian calendar here, the lunar months that they had. But he wasn't perfect. Just like you and me, Elijah was a man with like passions, as the New Testament says. He, after Carmel, after leading this last major revival to God, gets one troll comment, a death threat. We don't know what that's like, on his little Twitter account. And Jezebel herself, the real throne of Israel, right, says, you're dead. Same be done to me as to all the prophets of Baal if you're not dead within the day. And Elijah sees this real scary lady, and he runs with his tail between his legs. He goes all the way, like Israel's around the size of New Jersey in the United States, right? So you got Mount Carmel, which is up here in the Galilee region. He goes all the way down to the Sinai Peninsula, the same mountain where God revealed the Ten Commandments and manifested his glory directly to the people of Israel so that they would have miraculous proof and reason to believe these things. Now, it was actually really neat when God met him there, because despite being put into the state where he totally flakes out, he's saying, God, they've slaughtered all your prophets and I alone am left. God says, I got 7,000 other people ready to take your place. I don't need you. I'm using you. You're being used to bring about something wonderful, and I need you to start doing it again. And Elijah's like, no, I want to die. And so God's like, Elijah, come outside. I need to show you something. So Elijah goes out. He says, now watch. And so this huge hurricane force of a wind just knocks all the rocks in the mountains off. And nothing happens. He just sees this enormous force of nature. Then he sees this burst of fire. Nothing happens. And then an earthquake takes place. All this dramatic stuff, right? Nothing happens. And then, in the stillness and the quiet, God speaks to him. Not through the fire, not through the earthquake, not through the wind, but through a still small voice. Understanding that. It's a bond and relationship. He's not interested in signs or miracles. He wants the heart. And that's what he speaks to. Not the sight, not the senses, not the shock and awe, not improving himself. He's reaching people's hearts, and you need to be reminded of that. Even if there are a few left who will accept it, and we need to remember that too. But in concluding the book of 1 Kings, I'll just make this ultimate summary of King Ahab's reign before we transition to Jehoshaphat, Jeroboam, all those other different guys. His achievements were, and let's just be fair here, he made more alliances than any of the other mediocre kings of northern Israel, including making an alliance with the king of southern Judah, whose name was Jehoshaphat at that time. Now, it didn't obviously last long. I'll explain why in a moment. His mistakes, however, far outweighed this. His wife was one mistake, who ultimately was judged by God. We'll find out why in the next book, or rather how. I don't think we need to explain why. Second was his promotion of idol worship, especially that of Baal, and in fact his participation not only in Baal worship, but especially Molech worship, the abortion god, Planned Parenthood deity, right? Ultimately undid the most significant of his alliances when he was going to battle against the Syrians, and I'm fairly certain of that. He was allied with King Jehoshaphat. You had northern Israel and southern Israel coming against this king. And so this king knew Ahab's hobbies. And he said, I know how to get this kind of messed up here. And so he brings out one of his sons and he slits his own son's throat. Remember, king of Syria is doing this, the pagan. He slits his own son's throat and he has him bleed all over the city gate. And he says, in the name of Molech, this city gate shall not fall. We have your divine defense. He just tosses his son's body down. Now, King Jehoshaphat's looking at this, right? Still has a relationship with God, southern Israel. And he's just like, oh my gosh, there is a reason why we're here to get this guy out. Oh my gosh, this fake God and this horror. This guy just murdered his own son. Can you believe that? And Ahab's like, I'm sorry, what? And Jehoshaphat's, you didn't. Yeah, I did that too. I don't want to mess with Molech. He's got the city gates. We should go around. And Jehoshaphat just looks at him. He's like, just get out of here. They take the city. They take the Syrians out. But what's also interesting is in future engagements, and of course this will be included for us in 2 Kings, but he tries to play a sneaky thing by saying, after he was divinely warned, given 3 warnings, which was his third mistake. Ironically enough, I guess that would count for 5, but nonetheless, he ignored warnings from Elijah, from another prophet of God named Micaiah. I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's Micaih. And then finally, Jehoshaphat himself, he gives him a warning and saying, you need to stay on shaking ground with your relationship with God. You better be ready to fall through those cracks. You really need to get your act together. You better leave right now because God is not with you. He says, no, I can figure this out. So he tries to do the same thing that another certain individual did. He tries to dress as a common soldier. He takes off the golden band and all the fancy armor. He's like, oh, they won't be targeting me out. God can't guide them divinely to me if they don't see me. And so one of the Syrians was just shooting like a random arrow, and he ends up getting impaled. Now, this injury normally could be treated and stopped if he was given care right away, even back in those days. But all of his soldiers are just like, forget this, we're out of here. And they leave his body to rot. And so he bleeds out from this injury, and God was the one who sorted all this stuff out. But once again, that will be more details given to us in 2 Kings. Ahab's reign, total disaster. And once again, just like we saw with Solomon, just like we saw with all of these individuals, their relationship with God, their relationships, their choices of spouses, of friends, these things matter. And understand, as we read in the New Testament, bad company corrupts good character. If we can take that to heart, we can avoid a lot less speed bumps along the way that our own flesh is bad enough to have to keep us from avoiding. Thank you for your time and listening to the study. If you have any sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who could use this insight into a book that's probably, for all intents and purposes, more where the gold leaf probably still sticks together in your Bible, it's not the most read portion of Scripture, not the most inspiring, please share the study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. Remember that Jesus loves you, and remember, even more importantly, your choices and relationships matter, not just in this life, but especially in the next. And the good news is the perfect relationship is one that He offers to you first.